Hello everybody and welcome to this first lecture on abnormal psychology. As you'll see from this lecture and from your reading, my goal is not to be completely comprehensive and cover everything in the chapter, rather to highlight certain issues in a particular way. Our course has plenty of options. You will certainly have your reading. You have many opportunities to look at video clips and to go to various online websites and to read some journal articles that are particularly salient to our course. For this first lecture, I want to take up the question, what do we mean by abnormal psychology? Because when we talk of abnormal psychology, the implied question is that there's something that would be the opposite, namely normal psychology. And while you may have never thought of this issue, the line between normal and abnormal is one which is implicit in a lot of the judgments we make. For instance, when we meet a person and we start interacting with them, whether we want to admit it or not, or pay attention to it consciously or not, we're making internal judgments as to this person and who they are, and are they quote unquote normal? Do they have weirdnesses or eccentricities, or do those oddities rise to the level where internally we think to ourselves, whoa, something's off here? So the definition of what's normal and abnormal is not an easy thing to consider. If we were to ask for a definition of abnormal psychology or psychopathology or whatever we want to refer to the area of psychology we're going to study, here's our textbook's definition. The scientific study of abnormal behavior in an effort to describe, predict, explain, and hopefully help people change abnormal patterns of functioning. Now, that definition simply says that we want to be scientific. We don't want to just come up with theories that are not grounded in evidence-based research studies. And implicit in our definition also is that there is such a thing as behavior which we would consider abnormal. Now, which behavior is abnormal may depend upon all kinds of different things. For instance, very importantly here would be culture. But we're just going to accept that there is abnormal behavior. And having accepted that implicit kind of understanding, what do we want to do? And what does this course seek to do? Well, we need to describe the range of behaviors that qualify as abnormal. We want to know enough about what causes various types of psychopathology to be able to predict when something, some series of events happen to someone, the likelihood that they will experience kind of abnormal responses. We want to be able to have an understanding, and by that I mean explain not only the causes of abnormal behavior, but the dynamics, the understanding of it, and then clearly, finally, we want to help people change. In other words, we want to come up with interventions which allow people to alleviate or ameliorate their abnormal behavior, thoughts, emotions, so as to provide relief and better patterns of functioning. There are many, many definitions. We just gave you one as to what abnormal or psychological abnormality is. But we have to say, because of differences in culture, in, let's say, religious views, economic views, views of human views and definitions of human functioning, there's really no one definition which would be universally accepted. Just about all of the definitions of abnormal psychological functioning would be based upon what have been known as the 4Ds. And you could, take away some of these Ds or add one or two others, but the 4Ds would simply be that abnormal behavior, emotions, functioning would be associated with deviance, and we'll define that, distress, dysfunction, and danger. And as our next slide will attest, I want to just unpack these a little bit, but this definition isn't at all comprehensive. It's somewhat fluid, but at least it's a starting point for us to attempt to answer the question or questions: what is normal, and therefore at what point does normal behavior cross the line and become abnormal? So let's just talk about these. Let's talk about deviance in particular. Deviance is a word that I think is loaded because of the history of the use of that term. But all we mean by deviance is simply that someone deviates from an accepted or expected way of behaving. Usually this deviance would be from the values or norms of the groups or subgroups, or maybe even the society we live in. So for instance, deviance would change, and our definitions of deviance would change depending upon where we live in the world, what the understanding, the cultural and societal understanding, and even religious understanding of behavior is at that point. If I could give you an example of this, this would be social norms. 4 or 5 years ago, I happened to be in southwestern Ethiopia. And I had grown up in Ethiopia. My parents were missionaries, and so I was visiting my daughter, who was there with a college group, helping build a school. I got on an airplane, a very small plane, and I sat down in my seat, and about 2 or 3 minutes later, a woman got on with her baby. She was clearly a Muslim woman and was dressed in the full abaya, and sat in the seat next to me. And not really thinking clearly, I greeted her. I said hello in the language, Amharic is the language, and she completely ignored me. She didn't answer me. She didn't establish eye contact. She just ignored me. And as soon as that happened, I thought to myself, okay, that was dumb. Given the culture here I am, not only a man that's not related to her, but a foreigner, a white man, a stranger. Why would she reply to me? I was responding to the expected behavior of Americans when we perhaps get on a plane and someone is next to us. We just say hello and we greet each other, and that would be a social norm which is expected. Well, after the plane took off and we were in the air for about a half an hour, her baby started to cry, and so she did what most mothers do all over the world and for most of human history. She lifted up her abaya and started feeding her baby very openly. She didn't, as we would do in the United States, if a woman is nursing, just kind of hide it. It was very open. And it really struck me at that point that the social norm, if I was on an airplane in the United States sitting next to a woman, that certainly would violate some social norm. And we might argue with whether it's a good one. But it's just an example of how deviance may be drastically affected by where you are in the world and what the definitions of acceptable and unacceptable behavior are. So certainly while we use deviance, we have to take it with a grain of salt that what is deviant in one place may be perfectly acceptable in another place or another subculture or another context, and vice versa. The second D would be distress, Or simply, we might note that behavior or certain emotions or certain ideas and thoughts that cause distress to an individual, for instance, high levels of anxiety, or that cause distress to the people around an individual. Let's say you got on a subway or plane car and someone got up and started screaming or yelling or threatening people. Distress is simply a marker, this our second D, a marker which would say that for most of us, distress caused by our own ideas or behaviors or thoughts, or distress and threat caused by others around us, for most of us certainly would qualify as something that would be abnormal. Thirdly would be, our third D would be dysfunction. And this would simply say that behavior or thoughts or activities that get in the way of healthy functioning day to day might be problematic. So for instance, if I'm so obsessive and compulsive that when I write a paper, I have to spell check it and reread it 100 times before I hand it in. And that's causing me to consistently hand in my work late, which is penalizing me. And while my work may be, let's say, very, very good, my paper may be very, very good, I'm getting C's because my work is always late. Again, that would be dysfunction. Or if I have such high levels of anxiety that I'm afraid to leave my house, and or I'm terrified to drive my car, or I'm so afraid of getting attacked by a dog that I'm hesitant to walk down a street, that I know two dogs are present in the house. That would be dysfunctional. When we look at our behavior, so many of things we consider abnormal are in small dosages actually not only normal but very functional. So for instance, if I could go back to the example of anxiety, anxiety can be a very, very healthy thing. I should be anxious in some situations. Anxiety is a emotional cue or signal to me, hey, watch out. There's danger ahead and you could get hurt. However, when anxiety rises to a level in which it's somewhat irrational, or it in turn is causing me not to avoid pain, but actually to, by virtue of my responding to this huge level of anxiety, cause myself distress and dysfunction, then clearly it becomes problematic. So dysfunction becomes a very, very important factor. And as you see here with our slide, culture is important. Function, the ability to function is very, very different in one place as opposed to another. If I'm a farmer living in 17th century Missouri, my ability to function and the capabilities and skills I have to apply are very, very different than if I'm a computer programmer living in San Francisco in 2018. So dysfunction is based upon context. And finally, lastly, danger. This certainly might go along with deviance. It might go along with distress. It might go along with dysfunction. But when I'm dangerous to myself or others, I'm erratic, I'm engaged in behavior that for instance, suicidal ideation, or I'm so reckless in my driving because of my, kind of rage that I put not only myself, but the people I'm driving with or the people that are on the road with me in danger, that becomes problematic. And here is clearly where behaviors which we would consider, or most societies would consider criminal, would be considered abnormal, like abuse, physical abuse or sexual abuse, or rape, or any number of other things. So these 4 Ds are very, very helpful. They're not comprehensive, and we have to use them kind of in combination with each other, and always remember that there certainly would be other things that might qualify as abnormal, other not only Ds but anything else. But it certainly gives us a start in how to proceed. Now, there have been criticisms, and Thomas Szasz is probably the most famous of the people that criticize our modern understandings of abnormality. Szasz's critique, I think, is a valid one, and one that we should not dismiss. But what Szasz says is that our notions of abnormality, for instance, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 5th edition, which is the large kind of book which lays out all of the disorders and the various criteria for diagnosis and so on and so forth. Szasz and others have pointed out that our definitions of abnormality are really society's ways of conceptualizing and really pigeonholing people that are different. Szasz would point out that behavior comes, thoughts, emotions, behavior among human beings come with a wide range of manifestations. And every culture comes up with a definition of what's acceptable and unacceptable. And so our modern definitions of psychopathology are really a kind of a secular way of categorizing what, as a society, we've decided collectively is unacceptable behavior. Now, I like Szasz's critique, although personally I would think he goes too far. But let me just give you an example where this may apply. So certainly all of us have heard quite a lot about ADHD, this disorder in which children and adults, but let's just talk about children for a second here, are fidgety and can't pay attention to one task, and are a little bit hyperactive, and so on and so forth. Now, we could ask legitimately, is ADHD a disorder which exists independent of environment, or, as Szasz would point out, because we've developed education in school and we put relatively young children into classroom settings in which we require that they sit still and pay attention for, can we say, long periods of time. Szasz would point out, has the invention of school and putting 3 and 4 and 5, 6-year-olds into school, in other words, an environment which calls on children to sit still, has that really caused us to come up with this identification of ADHD as simply a way in which we categorize children that can't do that task? When in other times, other cultures where children didn't go to school so young, and they certainly didn't sit there, or there would be no such thing as ADHD. Children would be running around naturally. They wouldn't have to pay attention to books and to lessons. They would be out either playing or taking care of the sheep or helping their parents in the fields, where the disorder is simply a societal way in which we categorize children that can't engage in a task which, let's face it, is a little bit artificial for 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds. Sitting still, paying attention to a teacher, particularly if that teacher is not interesting. So Szasz and others, I think, have an interesting critique, and I think it's important to pay attention to it. And I, for one, am relatively skeptical, this is my editorial comment, that the study of abnormal psychology is as precise as we may want to believe, and certainly we'll get to that as we go through the semester. Even if we make the assumption that there is such a thing that we refer to as psychological abnormality, we run into just the fuzziness factor here. As we've already mentioned, the kind of imprecision of our definition. if you pick up the DSM-5 and leaf through it, and it's certainly very interesting to do, one of the things that strikes us is these criteria for defining this disorder, or that disorder are so often imprecise. Unfortunately, we don't have the ability, as we do with certainly bacterial and viral infections, to come up with a test for malaria, a test for Lyme disease, a test for a strep infection that definitively tells us, hey, you have this. The criteria for defining an anxiety disorder or a mood disorder are so much fuzzier, so much less precise, that we really have to always see this notion of abnormality, kind of put it as a work in progress, as something which probably will always remain less precise than we might hope.